So, with all of us, I learned an extraordinary amount from the Reverend last night. I mean, I thought I was going to learn a little bit about hip-hop, about which I know almost nothing, but instead, I learned an extraordinary amount about constitutional law. And I want to take the Reverend's invitation to reframe what I am talking about tonight along the same lines, to think about the same idea about how we think about rebooting in the context of democracy. As he put it, Ctrl+Alt+Delete. But before we go there, I want to start in a much darker place. I want to ask you, literally, a much darker place. I want to ask you to shut your eyes for a second. I can see you. Open your eyes. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. Shut your eyes for a second and think about one of the worst things you might have to think about in your life. For example, think about reluctantly coming to recognize your father has Alzheimer's and recognizing the struggle there will be in caring for him. Or people my age, think about the extraordinary suffering as you come to recognize your son or your daughter is afflicted with an addiction to drugs or to alcohol, and you have to work through the process of solving that addiction. Feel what that pain is. Okay, come back. And I'm going to be completely up now. That was the down part. Now we're up for a second. And I want to bring you back to this image that I'm sure many of you saw 2 years ago. Extraordinary image in a collection of images in the context of the Obama campaign by a photographer, Joe Crimmings. And this image leads us to think, as many of us thought, that we had won something 18 months ago. 365 electoral votes, 257 members in the House, and eventually 60 members in the Senate. We thought the victory would get us reform. And of course, that administration had extraordinary aspirations that were not, that says, tiny. Indeed, as the campaign argued to me in an angry email when I had criticized them once, they said, hey, look, we're running on a platform of universal health care, ending the Iraq War, a massive cap-and-trade system, $18 billion in new money for education, revamping of the tax code to make it more progressive, a restoration of our civil liberties and enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, a doubling of foreign aid, and a huge expansion of national service tied to making college more affordable, tightening regulation in the financial markets, unprecedented set of ethics, and that's sick. That was really the way they wrote it. Transparency rules governing the White House. And, of course, 18 months ago, all of this seemed totally possible to us. Anything seemed possible to us 18 months ago. This was the image 18 months ago. But over those 18 months, I've looked back on this image and I've realized that, in fact, there are three figures in this picture. And the one that I focused on, that hopeful youth with the Obama sign, is not the only prominent face. Look at this guy. Worried, skeptical, but even a man like this would have the power to woo Republicans to his side. Skeptical. I get that perspective now, but it wasn't my perspective then. That was my perspective then, and a giddiness then about the potential that election meant. 508 days ago, that election happened. And in that 508 days, we've all moved from this face to this face to this face and then to that face. Depressed, head down. 18 months ago, we were up. 18 months later, many of us are down. We've seen one major reform, health insurance reform, and an endless list of promised reform so far failed. One major reform, health insurance reform, a clear and important, critically important victory. But the question it should raise is, what does this one victory mean? Ezra Klein in the Washington Post said it means the twilight of the interest groups. As he wrote, the Obama administration succeeded at neutralizing every single interest group. And I read these words of Ezra, a writer whose words I often agree with, and I thought, gosh, Ezra, do I wish. And instead, I was drawn more to Glenn Greenwald's response to Ezra's post. Glenn wrote, if by neutralizing, Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefits, then he's absolutely right. But being able to force the government to bribe and accommodate you is not a reflection of your powerlessness. Indeed, quite the opposite. To pretend that this bill represents the twilight of the interest groups, that special interests have been neutralized, is just hagiography and propaganda. The way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it was done that way, but one cannot reasonably deny that it was.
Same as it ever was.
It's the same
as it ever was.
As it ever
Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was.
And it's the same as it ever was because Obama did not do what he told us was necessary. Candidate Obama, on the road, said, for far too long, through both Democratic and Republican administrations, Washington has allowed the lobbyists and campaign contributions to rig the system, no matter what it costs ordinary Americans. If we do not change our politics, if we do not fundamentally change the way Washington works, then the problems we've been talking about for the last generation will be the same ones that haunt us for generations to come. If we're not willing to take up that fight, the fight to change the way Washington works, then real change, change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. And he didn't take up that fight. His method of reform has been this bribing and accommodating, and the amount of reform this method will produce is tiny. Now you look at this and you say, come on, it can't really be that bad. Is it really that bad? No, it's not that bad. It's much, much worse. Indeed, you cannot begin to imagine just how bad it is, but if you want to, I recommend you read this book. Extraordinary book by Washington Post writer Robert Kaiser, So Damn Much Money, about the way the economy of influence in Washington has changed, and changed because of the transformation of this industry of lobbying. It is an economy, as Kaiser describes it. There are lobbyists, there are members, there are special interests, and they work together. Each pays the other. Each depends upon the other. So lobbyists pay members, both during and after their tenure in Congress. During their tenure in Congress, they pay members with cash, and not the cash of brown paper bags, but payment and support of campaigns. As the cost of campaigns has gone through the roof, members become increasingly dependent upon these lobbyists as a source of their cash. They spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money, and so these lobbyists become the suppliers, or to push this metaphor a bit, the pushers of this source of influence inside of Washington. That's how they pay during the time that they're members. Now, as Kaiser writes, this is new. Money has been part of the American politics forever, on occasion in the Gilded Age, or the Harding administration, for example, much more blatantly than recently, but the scale of it has just gotten way out of hand. The money may have come in brown paper bags in earlier eras, but the politicians needed and took much less of it than they take through more formal channels today. So, compare this man, Senator Max Baucus, a man who represents 0.3% of the American public. Max Baucus, when he was arguably the most powerful man overseeing the healthcare legislation in the Senate, raised more than $4 million from the very interests that he was regulating. Compare him with this man, Mississippi Senator John Stennis. No choir boy, Stennis. But when he was head of the Armed Services Committee in the early 1980s, a colleague asked him to hold a fundraiser for defense contractors. Stennis replied, "Would that be proper? I hold life and death over these companies. I don't think it would be proper for me to take money from them." Now the point is, that ethic that even John Stennis repeated is an ethic completely absent from the world of Washington today. The idea is never in Washington that you should restrain yourself. Indeed, quite the contrary. Leverage your power to raise as much money as you can and use the lobbyists during your tenure to support that fundraising. And then after, the lobbyists pay the members with futures. As my friend Jim Cooper from Tennessee puts it, Capitol Hill has increasingly become a, quote, farm league for K Street. Members and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model, a business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Public Citizen estimated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of senators left to become lobbyists on Capitol Hill, 42% of members of the House. And the point is, everyone then depends upon this system surviving. And in this way, then, they pay after and build the dependency while members are in Congress. And then members pay the interests through policy that gets changed, sometimes extraordinarily profitably. So this University of Kansas study estimated that the return from investment on lobbyist dollars spent to change this American Jobs Creation Act was 22,000%, which may explain why more and more money gets diverted to Washington to change laws rather than to invent the next great widget, and sometimes quite brazenly. So at the beginning of February, the New York Times reported about this fundraising trip Chuck Schumer made to Wall Street to raise money from Wall Street for the Democratic Party and for his own re-election. But as the New York Times reported, city titans of finance at a recent closed-door meeting accused Schumer of being insufficiently pro-Wall Street. One indignant fellow stood up and demanded his donation back. Now, remember, this is Chuck Schumer. There is no man in the United States Senate more responsible for turning complete deregulation over to Wall Street, yet this guy is insufficiently pro-Wall Street such that somebody could demand his donation back. The members then pay the interest. They get bent to this fundraising interest, and then the interests pay the lobbyists. As Kaiser puts it, early generation, enterprising young men came to Washington looking for power and political venture, often with ambitions to save or reform the world, but in the last fourth of the 20th century, such aspirations were supplanted by another familiar American yearning to get rich. So this industry, which is about the size of the recording industry in America, has produced enormous wealth. This is Gerald Cassidy, arguably the inventor of the way earmarks now get used. He's worth more than $100 million because of his influence through the lobbying firm he set up. And as lobbying firms become more valuable, Washington itself becomes richer and richer. Indeed, it is some of the richest counties in the whole nation are now surrounding Washington, D.C., as the business of selling policy turns out to be an enormously profitable business. It is an economy, one feeding the other. Now, yet, politicians deny this economy has any influence. One congressman told me, it's ridiculous to suggest that the money affects results. Maybe it affects access. As former Congressman Mazzoli put it, the people who contribute get the ear of the member and the ear of the staff. They have access, and access is it. Access is power. But as I was told, it doesn't change results. Now, I find this, pretty hard to believe. at least if you want to be charitable in interpreting what Congress does. Because there's a whole host of these easy cases, the kind of 2 + 2 = 4 cases of government, which the government just gets wrong. So as the introduction mentioned, I spent about 10 years of my life fighting in the context of copyright. That fight began on October 27, 1998, when President Clinton signed into a law a statute honoring this great American, Sonny Bono, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. A statute which extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. Now, the question Congress was to be asking when it passed this statute overwhelmingly was whether extending the term of an existing copyright could advance the public good. Now, of course, a copyright is designed to create incentives to produce something new. The one thing we know about incentives is that they are prospective. Even the United States Congress can't get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So it could make no possible sense to extend the term of an existing copyright from the perspective of public policy. Indeed, so clear was it that when we challenged the statute in the Supreme Court, this liberal economist, oh wait, that's Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize-winning economist, said he would sign a brief saying it could not possibly extend the public good only if the word no-brainer was in the brief somewhere. So clear was it that this could not be advancing the public good. Yet apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress enacted that statute, an easy public policy question which Congress just gets wrong. Or think about nutrition, something I'm working on recently. There's a consensus among people who know something about this that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. 2003, the World Health Organization decided they would try to advance public policy on the basis of this consensus. So they promulgated standards saying no more than 10% of your daily caloric intake should come from added sugar. Well, the sugar industry, they have this sweet little logo. They went ballistic. There they are, ballistic. They got the United States Senate to threaten to withdraw funding from the WHO if the WHO didn't back down from their crazy standard. Here's Senator Larry Craig writing the WHO to demand this back down. They wanted the WHO instead to adopt the reasonable standard that 25% of your daily caloric intake come from added sugar. Well, the WHO didn't back down, but our government did. 2003, the Food Nutrition Board promulgated standards saying that 25% of your daily caloric intake could come from added sugar. This is a balanced diet, according to our government. You can start with Fruit Loops or M&Ms for breakfast, have a glass of milk, then a cheeseburger for lunch, and then pizza, pepperoni pizza. Indeed, 3 slices of pepperoni pizza for dinner, and of course, sugar cookies for dessert. That is a balanced diet according to our government. Again, easy public policy question which our government just gets wrong. Or think most profoundly in the context of global warming. There's a consensus, at least until there was a snowstorm in Washington this year, that we're doing it. As Gore puts it, the debate's over. There are 5 points in this consensus. Number 1, global warming is real. Number 2, we human beings are mainly responsible. Number 3, consequences are very bad. Number 4, we need to fix it quickly. And number 5, it's not too late. Someone tried to evaluate how strong that consensus was. So they did a random sample of 1,000 peer-reviewed articles between 1993 and 2003 to determine whether they endorsed or questioned that consensus. They found that 0%, exactly 0 of those articles, questioned that consensus. Then someone did a comparable study of popular media articles between roughly the same period, 1988 to 2002. They found that 53% of those articles questioned the basic consensus. And that difference, of course, is the product of junk science spread into this field, which gives the politicians the cover to delay for at least a decade addressing this, arguably, the globe's most important public policy question at all. Again, easy public policy question, which the government just gets wrong. Or finally, think about financial services. There's an extraordinary book just came out called 13 Bankers by Simon Johnson and James Quack. They have an account of this meltdown. It's a very complicated account, but I'm going to try to simplify it here. It goes something like this. There was a depression. It was very bad. The government responded by creating some simple principles to govern oversight, at least in the context of financial instruments. Basically, every major financial instrument, from bonds to stocks to savings, would be supervised under this system, aka, it's a bad word, I know, but regulated, through public, transparent, anti-fraud requirements that would make sure that the markets could work in an efficient and honest way. In the 1990s, we had a wild innovation in thinking about this structure of regulation. People began to say it was a bad idea. We launched forward with deregulation of an extraordinary array of new financial instruments. These financial instruments, these new financial instruments, derivatives, and all this other junk would be privately regulated. So these standards of public, transparent, anti-fraud requirements were reversed. There was no public requirements, no non-transparent mandates, and no anti-fraud requirements put into this at all. Now, what we don't recognize, indeed, for much of this period, people didn't actually even have the numbers to see this. And this is an estimate I'm going to show you. We don't actually have completely the numbers yet. Is that before this, quote, innovation, the vast majority of the financial services sector was subject to this set of regulation. Tiny slice that wasn't. But after these innovations, the vast majority of the financial services sector was not subject to this regulation. Only a tiny slice was. And of course, that change created the incentives and opportunities for the bubble. But that wasn't enough for Wall Street. This deregulation wasn't enough. They also wanted, as 13 bankers described, a certain kind of re-regulation. So on the one hand, they could do whatever they wanted, they could gamble however they wanted, but they wanted, on the other hand, some additional regulatory support. What was that? A government guarantee that when these bubbles burst, there would be a bailout of this industry for the consequences of their gambling. And of course, they got it. They got this guarantee long before the bubble burst. In a series of signals, the market was told by the Fed and by regulators that there would be a backstop if everything blew up, and turns out that created an obvious set of incentives, producing what Krugman and others describe as socialized risk and privatized benefit. Now, from any perspective, this was an insanely stupid structure of regulating the most important component of our economy. So why were we so stupid? Who knows? All I can show you is the extraordinary rise in campaign contributions during precisely this period when government deregulated and re-regulated in this one way to produce the collapse that we saw in 2008. Now, in all of these cases, the government gets these simple cases wrong, either because the government's filled with idiots, or because the government's guided by something other than reason. And my own view, I know this is controversial, is that our government is not filled with idiots. It is not stupidity that produces these results. It's the fact that they are dependent on a system of influence that drives them to allow these results to occur. And of course, not just in the easy cases. Everywhere policy gets bent to those who pay, and public trust is then weakened. Indeed, the view of the overwhelming majority of Americans, depending on the poll, between 80 and 95%, is that money buys results in Congress, leading Congress to now have a 22% confidence rating, the lowest in its history. Arguably, more people had confidence in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than have faith in our Congress today. And that fact, in turn, produces enormous cynicism. And that cynicism, in turn, produces the disengagement that leads the vast majority of ordinary Americans to not participate in our political process. Well, that's bad. But it's going to get worse. You might have heard of this institution. This is the United States Supreme Court. They just decided this case, Citizens United versus the FEC. In Citizens United, the Supreme Court discovered that the free speech clause of the First Amendment guaranteed an unlimited corporate independent expenditure right. Corporations are free to spend as much as they want on political elections. Now, let's put this in context. I've always wanted to be able to do this. I need a, remember that Al Gore in his movie had the forklift. I really need a forklift at this point. They don't have one, but you're going to have to imagine it with me here. So in 2008, the total amount raised by all candidates, challengers, and incumbents to run for Congress was $1.4 billion. Less than 10% of that came from contributions in $200 or less. Last year, lobbyists spent $3.47 billion lobbying Congress. Of that $3.47 billion, less than 1.2% came from organized labor. Okay, now those two numbers, total amount raised, total amount spending, now need to be compared with what we might expect will happen in response to Citizens United. So, take 1% of the profits of the Fortune 400 in 2008, 1% of those profits. And imagine now, liberated by the Supreme Court, they decide to devote 1% to campaign expenditures. This is where I get on my forklift. $6.2 billion. It goes way up above the top, right? $6.2 billion more than the total amount raised in 2008 and the total amount spent on lobbying in 2009. That new influx of money is guaranteed to do just one thing, to reinforce this sense of dependency that has been produced already by a Congress that most people believe does nothing more than think about what keeps the funders happy. Now, the Supreme Court says, no problem. We can require disclosure. Congress can require disclosure. So if Exxon comes into a district and says, we're going to spend $10 million to get somebody who thinks that Al Gore has been smoking a bunch of weed and believes global warming is just made up, they can publicize that fact. And the voters then can decide whether to support that candidate has been so overwhelmingly supported by Exxon. But the thing the Supreme Court missed, because there's no politician on the Supreme Court anymore, is that disclosure can't begin to measure the influence here. Because there is, as political scientists put it, an extraordinary amount of missing money in campaign disclosure reports. This fantastic study just recently released called The Iceberg Theory of Campaign Contributions addresses a puzzle that political scientists have been struggling with for more than 50 years. The puzzle is why there isn't more corporate money in campaigns. Because they point out all these cases where corporations get enormous amounts of benefit, but they don't pay much for it. So for example, the sugar industry, there are 6 major producers of sugar in the United States. They have tariffs that protect them from competition or from other sugar producers. So the cost of sugar in the United States is about twice of what it is in Canada. Those tariffs benefit the sugar industry by more than $1 billion. Yet, the sugar industry only spends $3.5 billion in campaign contributions. So you think, that's a pretty bad deal, for Congress. They're only spending $3.5 billion, yet they're getting $1 billion in $3.5 million are getting $1 billion in benefits. You'd think Congress would at least hold out a little bit and say, we want to get $500,000 in contributions before we're going to give you $1 billion. So that's the problem of the missing money. Well, what these theorists say is actually, the way to understand this is to recognize that interests can not only give you money, they can also threaten to give your opponent money. And if the threat is credible, you're going to respond just as effectively as if they had given you that money. So they could give you $14,000. That's the same as if they gave you $4,000 and threatened to give $10,000 to the other side. So that's where the missing money is. And the point is that influence now is just as important even though the money isn't spent. This is the sense of the iceberg then. We have a little bit that you see, but in fact there's an extraordinary amount underneath that's threatened but not actually given. And the point is, after Citizens United, where the amount that they can threaten is unlimited, this marionette Congress becomes the marionette Congress squared, because we will never even know the threats that have been made to force members to conform to the behavior that this extraordinary, powerful set of interests has. This is bad, and it's getting much, much worse. I think we have to confront this crisis of democracy. Now, if we were wrong, we would say, never waste a good crisis. But in fact, waste is exactly what the administration has done here. I was at a meeting where a senior representative from the White House reported that the administration to believe it was his role to try to address the problem in Congress. It was their role to fix the presidency, not to fix the problems in Congress. Leading to the obvious question, does the president think the president is the problem with the current way that the government of the United States is functioning? And the point is, even if they intend to do it eventually, we can't wait for them to take the lead here. Democracy can't wait for them to take the lead here. We need to do something now. And what I think we should do is we should take inspiration from this case. Citizens United. Do a little editing here. Citizens Unite. And let the idea of citizens uniting inspire us to how, in fact, we could reboot democracy. Ctrl+Alt+Delete. So, control. Who should exercise control? Well, obviously citizens, but citizens in a movement, I think, that has three principles. Number one, this movement should be a citizens' movement, not a politicians' movement. We've had enough of these funny coiffed, fake smiled people. I love the governor, but cyborgs are a little bit too much inside of the movement. We need non-members of Congress in this movement. We need people who want to make Congress different, citizens. That's number one. Number two, it has to be cross-partisan. So we need the Tea Party, we need the Coffee Party, we need the Green Tea Party, we need the Instant Coffee Party. All of these parties need to be able to be part of this movement, because even though we don't have common goals, we could have and do have a common enemy. And number three, the movement has to achieve a restoration of a certain kind of integrity, the sort of integrity that we understand the framers were attempting to build into this structure of democracy. Now, what exactly would we do to achieve that integrity? Well, here's where the delete comes in. We need to delete this corrupting influence. As a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt told us more than 102 years ago, that corrupting influence is money inside of elections. He pushed for what we could call citizen-funded elections. Voluntary opt-in systems where small dollar contributions were the only contributions members of Congress took to get elected to Congress, so that no one could believe that money buys results, so that anybody could believe, as we all want to believe, that whatever the reason was that Congress did whatever stupid thing Congress did, it was either because there were too many Democrats or too many Republicans or because they were too stupid, but not because of the money, so that we could destroy the way this marionette Congress functions. So, for example, right now, the Larson-Jones bill in the House, the Fair Elections Now Act, would make it so that a member could opt into a system where every $100 contribution got matched 4 to 1, so it's worth $500, and thereby run a campaign only with small dollar contributions. Or an alternative, Professors Ackerman and Ayers have pushed a system where every citizen gets, the Republicans like, vouchers. So here, democracy vouchers, which they could spend on a candidate, and then they could contribute their own money up to $100. The magic thing about the democracy vouchers is that for every voter, that would produce $6 billion in the system, maybe a match for the $6 billion that the other side has. Now, either way here, this would make possible the restoration of trust in this government. Now, contra the Reverend. This is all about equality. This is all about equality that has been lost. Right? We have a system that says one person, one vote. It's a constitutional guarantee. It's astonishing how carefully the courts assure this constitutional guarantee. They have judges sitting with computer programs to make sure that every district is within 0.05% of another district in population to make sure one person, one vote, equal voting power. But the system we have means that before anyone votes, before any vote is cast in any election for president or members of Congress, it is money that filters who gets to run. Because parties, both Republicans and Democrats, decide whether they're going to support you based on whether you can raise an extraordinary amount of money. And who are you raising money from? From a tiny percentage of the American public. That tiny percentage picks who the candidates are. And then after that, we have, quote, equality. Now, there's a technical legal response to this system. It goes something like this. What the fuck? How could this possibly be constitutional? The idea that we are so concerned to make sure votes have equal power, yet not at all concerned about the fact that the votes are irrelevant by the time they have the power. It would be funny if it weren't such an extraordinary tragedy for this democracy. So, Reverend, when you say you want to make survival possible, the only way we make survival possible with global warming is make it possible for candidates to run and take a position that is right and not the position that the funders want them to take. The only way to make it possible The only way to make survival possible is to take up this fight of equality. The only way to change this system is through citizen-funded elections. Now, how can we get it? How can we get citizen-funded elections? Well, as was mentioned in the introduction, Joe Trippi and I started this group, Change Congress. Change Congress has now set up this site, Fix Congress First, that gives people a set of tools that they can use for the purpose of getting members to sign on to this bill. So you can go to our Take Action site, and then you can see where your representative is. Here, we can do that right now. What's the zip code here? I think it's 97701. Okay, great. So let's see where the representatives are around here. Whoa, no senators supporting fair elections. So then it says we can call Ron Wyden. Should we call Ron Wyden? All right, let's call Ron Wyden. Let's call up my Skype here. And I just happened, to have Ron Wyden's number in my Skype, so let's go. Let's ask what's going on here, Senator. Okay, Senator Ron Wyden, here we go. They're probably in bed, right? So. Slow answering at the Senate's office. Oh, they don't work so hard anymore. This was such a great opportunity for a conference call. I was so excited about it. Okay, then somebody else is going to have to call Senator Ron Wyden. And every senator from Oregon and ask the same question. What is the question? Why are you not supporting this extraordinarily important change to the way congressional elections are funded? I'm sorry, he's obviously not taking my calls anymore. Okay. Except the computer wants me to keep on going. All right, so fine. All right, so you have to call Senator Wyden. You have to do this for me. Okay, number two. What's the second thing we want to do? Well, we're going to also take a little bit of inspiration from Citizens United. We're going to create a movement called Funders United. Okay, so you've heard of Citizens United. How many people have heard of Funders United versus the FECC? Right, so Citizens United, Citizens for the Federal Election Commission. Funders United was Funders United versus the famously ethically challenged Congress. So Citizens United was a case decided in the Supreme Court. Funders United is a case that's going to be decided in the Supreme Court, which of course is not the Supreme Court, but the court that is the Constitution, right? So this is a case about money versus Congress. Funders United is about using money to change Congress, using money to break this link so that Congress is no longer the marionette Congress. How? Well, we're going to build this funders pledge that the top funders and then everybody else who funds elections in this context take. They say they will give no more money to any candidate unless that candidate irrevocably commits to citizen-funded elections. Now, I wanted to, give this as a slogan, kind of the just say no slogan. I want to appeal to the right. Then I found out it's trademarked, so I can't actually use that. So we're going to update it a little bit. Just text no, right? Just text no to every member who asks you for money and tell them no more money unless you have committed to reform here. That's Funders United here for these citizen-funded elections. Now, many people look at this and they say, is this going to be enough? These two kinds of steps, and of course there's steps many others are taken too. Is this going to be enough? And I'll confess I'm a little skeptical. Because we've been waging this war inside the Beltway to change this system for more than 30 years. A conventional battle for more than 30 years. There has been progress. 140 co-sponsors on this bill is fantastic. But you just got to wonder, is this conventional battle going to be enough? Is a man like this simply going to walk away from all the money in the world? The answer to that is no. And that's where the alt in this Ctrl+Alt+Delete comes in. Constitution of the United States has a provision for amending the Constitution, Article 5. Article 5's ordinary amending procedure, the procedure that's been used for every single amendment, is that Congress proposes an amendment that the state legislatures or state conventions then ratify. But Article 5 has an alternative proposal, an alternative path called a convention. A convention called for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution. And if 34 states call for a convention, like for example, we can imagine Oregon being the first, and then like wildfire, across the whole country, states increasingly call for a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution. Then we get to the position where we have a convention. Now, the call can be for any purpose, right? That's what's politically interesting about this. Some might call for the purpose of balancing the budget. Others might call for the purpose of public funding, whatever. Doesn't matter what the call is, so long as 34 call, that's enough. And then the proposals that come out of the convention need to be ratified by 38 states, by the legislatures or conventions in 38 states, not by referenda. So people who are afraid of this whole process need to remember there are 12 solid red and blue states on both sides here that could block any such amendment. Any such amendment, therefore, would have to be an amendment that could get the broad swath of public support. And this is the alternative path we need to think about if we're actually going to think about making this change real. And so we launched a site, callaconvention.org, which is rolling out this platform for organizing states and a platform for debating ideas for a set of amendments, simply because increasingly we believe there is no other way to get the attention of Congress. And even if we fail in getting to the total number necessary, what we have to remember is the certain kind of terror, that's supposed to be Nancy Pelosi, it doesn't really look like it, but the terror that this process of calling for a convention would produce inside of Washington. This progress to 35 would produce greater terror from Congress as the number of states increased, because the effect is that they imagine losing control over this process. And as they see that they could lose control, they will respond. They will respond with reform. Indeed, there is precedent for this. The Reverend gave you a very extensive lesson in constitutional law last night. You, of course, then remember this amendment, the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment is the only amendment that fundamentally changed the power of Congress. But it was only proposed after there was a convention movement that had taken off, and after it was clear there was going to be a convention if they didn't staunch this movement. So it was the fear of the convention that led to that change, or in a kind of appropriate font, that change, that produced the 17th Amendment, and I think we need to try this process again. Try this way to reboot this democracy. Try this way that recognizes we need the control through this alternative path to delete this corrupting influence inside of Washington. Now, so I have just one more thought. I'm sure all of you know this fantastic company, StrideRight. They gave us Keds. Arnold Hyatt is the man who gave us StrideRight. He's a very sweet, wealthy man, very odd, because there's only one picture on the internet of Arnold Hyatt, and it's tiny. You can't even see what he looks like. Okay. Now, Arnold is a loyal Democrat. And in 1996, he was the #2 largest contributor to the Democratic Party. So in 1996, Bill Clinton, I tried to hide his funny finger there, invited him to the White House with 30 other fat cats. 30 other top contributors to hear from these contributors what Bill Clinton should do as president. Now, we don't have any tape or photographs from this event, and we don't have a picture of Arnie Hyatt standing up. I think it looked something like that when he stood up. But Arnie Hyatt stood up. And Arnie Hyatt gave his opinion to President Clinton. Arnie said, "Mr. Clinton, I understand you're a big admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I want you to put yourself back to 1939, when Roosevelt recognized he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy." And Arnie said, "Mr. Clinton, you too have to do the same thing. You need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against the Nazis, but a war against us fat cats. A war against everybody in this room, people who use their money to influence Washington, a war against the very corruption of this democracy." There was silence in the room after Arnie made his plea. The story is told in this book by Larry Mackinson that Clinton's response effectively slashed Hyatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Because, of course, in Clinton's view, we didn't come to power in order to just give it away. Now, I think 14 years later, we need to finally recognize that Arnold Hyatt was right. We need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Now that Sarah Palin has told us we can use language like this, use language like take up arms and not mean actually take up arms, then let us too use this language. We need to take up arms. We need to do this to save democracy. Because who do we draft to fight our wars? You guys, the young people. The young people are drafted to fight our wars. And what can we say about this war? Well, unlike some wars, we can say this war is necessary. If democracy is going to survive, if there's going to be a reason to get on the bus, then winning must mean that we get the policies we fight for. If there's a reason to get on the bus, then you must wage this war. Now, go back to the moment that I asked you to start with. Go back to that horrible image of this struggle. The struggle of recognizing this kind of problem that you know you have to face. And then recognize the other half of that problem. The reason there's a struggle when you think about taking care of your sick father is that you love your father. The reason there's a struggle when you think of taking care of your addicted children is because you love your addicted children. I want you to recognize that this democracy, which we liberals can say we love just as easily as conservatives can, we can be as patriotic as conservatives can, this democracy that we love is sick. And we, however reluctantly, have got to confront the fact that unless we devote ourselves to curing it, it will die. We love our tradition, our country, our principles. We love who we've been. We need to give our children a reason to love us for saving it. Join us in this. Thank you very much.